Okay, well, welcome out. This is another in a series of our economics, look into economics. Today is Thomas Sowell, and without further ado, let's get right into him. This is an introductory video. It's based on his book, Basic Economics, which has a lot to it. So if we look here, this is an online version. You can just go online, Thomas Sowell, search Thomas Sowell YouTube, Thomas Sowell Economics. One of the first items to come up. You can see it's a very lengthy book. He wrote, I think this is his second edition, and he probably doubled the size of the book over his initial edition. So it goes into, of course, economic basics. You can get this stuff, and the book that I use for my classes, most of this stuff, Common Sense Economics. What is economics? You know, describing something up front, you always want to define things, define terms. I talk about this in my coaching. First of all, first and foremost, what do you want to do? If you want to achieve, if you want to get a college education, the question is, do you? Do you really? Why are you jumping the gun? Do you know who you are first and foremost? Let's find out who you are. And then from there, maybe you needed a college education. Maybe you need some reading outside of college. Maybe you need some coaching, maybe you need some classes, maybe you need some webinars, some seminars, and some other miscellaneous things to get you up to snuff as regards your goal. So like I said, first and foremost, what you want to do is find out who you are. What are your basic innate talents, gifts, abilities, tendencies, leanings, strengths, right? And we talked about the Briggs-Myers or the typology test that will get you there, or begin to get you there, right? And then from there, you want to figure out what it is that you like to do, and then kind of pick a career heading in that direction. And then you can start thinking about education. The thing with most people going off to college is that they think, I need a degree. Well, you're jumping the gun. How do you know what degree you need if you don't know you, if you don't know where your basic talents, gifts, tendencies, and leanings, natural, innate, born with them, tendencies and leanings are, right? Anyways, back to economics. What is economics? Is the role of prices is very important. Economic decision making, that's how economists make decisions in free markets. That only happens in free markets. In socialist markets, there is no freedom of choice, so people don't freely choose and purchase items, and you can't get much data from prices because the prices are usually set. They're usually exorbitant. They're usually jacked up. They're usually not appropriate. But in the free markets, the prices are set by supply and demand, right? And here's your supply and demand, right? The next item, first two are prices and costs, right? The role of prices, price controls, and he's got a few chapters on that, and more on prices, overview of prices, incentives versus goals. Incentives are very important in economics. Why are people incentivized to make this purchase instead of that? Back in the 80s, there were certain purchases that were made that are quite different from now because of the rise in prices. Back in the 80s, people used to put more money into homes. They used to put more money into clothes. They used to put more money into food. But because the prices of those things have gone up, they put less money into those things, right? Probably more money into insurance and healthcare because the prices of those have gone up over what they used to be 40, 50 years ago. Anyways, profits, cost of production, corporations, monopolies and cartels. I mean, antitrust laws, productivity, so forth. I mean, he really, unemployment statistics, working conditions, he really goes into the details. The book that I have my students read, Common Sense Economics, is very basic, much more basic than this book. And I'm only about halfway through the chapters here. And it goes on returns on investment, speculation, insurers. I doubt many people out there would want to sit down and read all of this unless you're going to be an economist yourself. I guess this is probably more of an advanced read. Not that it's something that somebody with a basic understanding couldn't read, but I'm sure those with a basic understanding, unless they really have a propensity for getting into deeper into economics, wouldn't read this text. This involved the role of money, laws, law and order, government revenues, international trade. I mean, he's just got imperialism, population, brand names, saving non-economic value, saving lives, the history. So he's got everything in here. It's quite a few hours of even listening. I eventually will probably get through most of this over the coming months. That's one of my up and coming goals, is to sit down and listen to as much of this as I can. So anyways, we've got a video here that we're just going to walk through. It's a half hour long. I don't know if I'm going to play the whole thing, but probably most of it. We'll see how it goes.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to join us, by the way, on Facebook at facebook.com/UNC Knowledge. Facebook.com.
This is the Hoover Institute, and this guy, most of the videos that I've watched is this guy interviewing Thomas Sowell. So very informative, very enlightening. He doesn't just talk about economic issues. He talks about social issues, political issues, and otherwise.
/UNC Knowledge. An economist, syndicated columnist, and best-selling author, Thomas Sowell is a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Over the course of his long and storied career, Dr. Sowell has taught economics at institutions including Cornell, Amherst, and UCLA. Dr. Sowell's latest book, a revised and updated version of his classic volume, Basic Economics. Here is the first edition of Basic Economics, and here is the new edition showing that Tom Sowell never rests. To quote from Basic Economics, through its various editions, the fundamental idea behind Basic Economics remains the same. Learning economics should be as uncomplicated as it is informative, close quote. Welcome, Tom. No charts, no equations, all words, plain English.
And this is something that I have heard other economists say, that there's no reason why the average person can't know the basics about economics, even though it's rarely known and probably even more rarely taught. Why we get reading, writing, arithmetic in the school, but we don't get basic economics, and there's some other things I could harp on as well. But why we don't get basic economics, a couple classes in high school, beyond me. Is money not something that's important to everybody? Money, the monetary system, finance, is the very water in which we swim, just like the laws surround us. Money and economic concerns surround us at the familial level, the personal level, local, state, national, international. It's all over the place. It's the very air we breathe. So why we don't know more about economics is beyond me. Therefore, this is why this is part of my program. But anyways, let's go ahead.
No graphs. All right. Well, would you help me to uncomplicate a few things today? All right. Segment 1, the present crisis. Now, I posted notices several places that I'd be interviewing you and asked folks for questions and got overwhelmed with questions. I can only offer a few, but here are some. From Ken Sweeney of Ricochet. This is the basic of the basics. How is wealth created? And why does the United States have the highest per capita GDP of any major country?
Do you know this? Do you know that the United States is about 6% of the world's population, and it contains about half of the world's wealth? Why? Is the United States just inherently selfish? No, the United States is inherently productive. The United States is inherently less corrupted, proportionally so, than other countries. It's more interested in, or focuses more on, liberty and freedoms. and freedoms of the individual, the right to speech and assemble and choose your religion and work where you want to work and so forth and all that good stuff. That is what makes an economy thrive. All right. Some of the things.
Wow. But how many years do I have to answer this question?
It's television. You've got about 90 seconds at the most.
Oh, I guess wealth is created when the circumstances are such that people who know how to create it are free to do so. One of the things that pains me is
they're free to do so. Keyword free.
The current crisis is people saying that Congress really needs to do something to make the economy recover. No, they need to let the economy recover. That the economy did not get to be the biggest in the world by politicians doing things.
And that's called the laissez-faire concept or methodology or ideology, I guess you would say, right? Just leave things alone, government. Stay out of things. And when things have gotten bad, oftentimes it's because of the government stepping in too much, overstepping its responsibilities.
All the millions of other people whose names we don't even know, those are the people who made it the biggest economy in the world. And if politicians will get out of their way, we can and let the economy recover. It can do that.
Tom, we've been talking about the crisis. Let's take a step back. 1983 until 2008, the American economy experiences a quarter of a century of nearly uninterrupted economic growth. Then, beginning in the autumn of 2008, trouble. What went wrong?
Well, actually, it started much earlier, and I think it was the housing boom, followed by the housing bust, which occurred in 2006.
2006.
And so the reverberations of that is, there are people out there who had trillions of dollars invested in securities based upon mortgages, and when people stopped paying their mortgages, the value of the securities vanished into thin air.
So you do not argue that this was a financial crisis that spilled over into the real economy. You argue that it was a problem in the real economy, particularly the housing market,
yes,
that started the problem in the financial sector.
Oh, absolutely. If people had kept paying their mortgages, the securities would have been good, and we would have all lived happily ever after. Now the problem is that the politicians made the mortgages more risky by changing the rules. In other words, at one time, mortgages were considered the safest investment. This is for the widows and orphans who need their money coming in regularly, and you put it into real estate. But the politicians decided that we must have more home ownership and more affordable housing. And so they began to prescribe rules. You had to lend money to people you wouldn't have lent to before. And of course, there was a reason they weren't lending to them before. And we discovered the hard way what that reason was, that they weren't likely to be able to pay them back.
And that's the key. So we might have to do something on that, the 2008 subprime market collapse, subprime housing market collapse. The problem is that the government stepped in with HUD and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and tried to make it possible for everybody to buy a home, right? Not everybody has enough money to buy a home, like Thomas Sowell just said here. So forcing people into that situation, giving them, for instance, balloon loans, where when they signed up, the loan was maybe $900 a month, and then in a year or so, it ballooned up to $2,000, $3,000 a month or more, maybe even, right? And people guaranteed loans, people going in for loans and no background check to see if they had any money, to see even if they had a job. And some were getting, these huge loans, home loans, and there was just no way that they were going to pay it. And it ended up in 2 or 3 million homes going into bankruptcy and foreclosure, and that nearly destroyed, they could have easily destroyed our entire US economy. And it could have rippled over into the rest of the world, because the United States is the standard bearer of the dollar, the monetary unit around the world, right? Everybody trusts on old Uncle Sam, to be the stabilizer, to be the dependable one, and all that good stuff. Anyways, let's continue.
Profound question here, I think, anyway. Did what happened indicate the housing market problem? Did that indicate that markets, some markets, wonderful as they are, wonderful as you demonstrate over and over again in basic economics that free markets are, that they sometimes experience troubles, calamities even, that the markets are imperfect because they're rooted in human experience and we live in a fallen world? Or did it demonstrate that the government messed things up?
The government messed them up. After all, for a century, you never had this kind of crash in the real estate market. For a century, people did their life's work lending money for mortgages, did that without the politicians interfering. Once the politicians started meddling, the results were what you could have predicted. It's what was predicted, in fact.
All right. Response to the crisis. The Federal Reserve floods the financial markets with liquidity, while first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration enact stimulus and bailout packages that now amount to as
Flooding the market with liquidity. You gotta love these terms. It's just dumping a bunch of cash into the economy, bailout money, like Bush. He was just talking about Bush, writing checks, or Biden writing checks, stimulus checks. And I've talked about this before. Are they really stimulus checks? They're loans that you, the taxpayer, have to pay back on. And if you don't pay back on, it has to be paid somewhere, somehow, some way. It's basic. Anytime the government prints money, and that's not a very accurate term because most money is not printed anymore. It's not coined or printed. It's basically electronic entries on a computer, right? Anytime, and I'll just use that. So when I say printed, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so when money is printed, basically it's just monetized debt, money debt, loans. That's all. It's not money. It's money that's being used, but it's money that has to be paid back. Government doesn't have any money. Federal Reserve doesn't have any money. U.S. Treasury doesn't have any money, right? They don't have any money. Even your own banks, public banks don't have any money, right? It's all borrowed, or even the private banks, the investors, the Sachs. I always forget the Coleman and Sachs, whatever the hell the name is. I'm not a financier, so I don't know the names of these private banks. Any of these banks that need money, they borrow it. The banks borrow money, the government borrows money, private citizens borrow money, businesses borrow money, and all that money that is borrowed is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, way over the 35 trillion that the government owes. You've got the government owing 35 trillion, and then you throw in the other three parts of the equation, and you're talking what, 150 plus the unfunded debt. You're talking 150 trillion dollars owed, not just 35 trillion, but way more. This is crazy. It's crazy, and why more people don't know about this. Maybe your government doesn't want you to know about it. Maybe that's why you don't learn about it in school. Keep down the QT, to down low, the hush hush, because we just want to do what we want to do. And don't you worry your pretty little common person heads. We'll take care of it from up here. The intelligentsia, smart people with all the money and all the know-how and all the power. Unfortunately, they don't necessarily have all the smarts, that's for sure. Nor are they the most ethical people, right, by any stretch of the imagination. So that creates problems, and what creates problems is not having enough. You would think it would be regulation and the money police or whoever, watch these entities, watch the businesses and watch the politicians, but it needs to be you and me, brother, sister. It needs to be you and me. We need to know what's going on. We have to be the police people, right?
Best I can make it out, something like $3.6 trillion. Correct responses to the crisis? Did the government do the right thing?
No. Those are easy questions.
All right.
One of the painful things, you can call anything you want to call it. You can call it a stimulus. All the data indicated didn't stimulate anything except boondoggles across the country.
Didn't stimulate anything. There you go. Thank you, Thomas.
As politicians handed out money to all the special interests that they are interested in pleasing. But for example, when
Didn't I say that? Talked about this before as well, too, right? It's not so much that the politicians couldn't fix the problem. They don't want to fix the problem. They don't want to stop spending. They don't care about the debt going up and up and up. Why? Because they want to curry favors. They want to get into office, stay in office, move up in office, make more money. So they go to their special interest groups and give them the benefits. Just like I heard recently, you will not believe this. This is, I want to cuss right here, but I wanted to cuss. Blank and unbelievable that, and this has happened in recent years, where individuals have not paid their tax bills or some small portion of their tax bill. There was a woman, an elderly woman somewhere in the South, who didn't pay $8 some odd cents tax bill and had her house taken, right? It was actually, and guess what? The mayor gave that house or gave that property to some special interest group or individual, someone through whom he would benefit, right? Just monsters, evil, malicious monsters. Fortunately, because of the fact that this has been publicized by the press, and this is what the press is supposed to be doing. It doesn't do its job anymore. It just kind of gossips and bitches about things, or gets a certain political bent and doesn't care about us. It just pushes its own axe, has an axe to grind, right? The media, mainstream media, the legacy media has an axe to grind, and they want certain things from the political elite, right? And that's what they're more concerned about that than you and me. No doubt about it. If you want to argue about it, please do. I've got tons of sources that I could show you. But anyways, so this is what goes on time and time and time again. And Sowell is trying to educate us. We must. And I know I'm getting old, so it's not so much me anymore. You guys, the younger people, you really, really, really got to know this stuff. You really got to know what's going on so that you can do something about it. You as a collective, like the Borg. You ever see that? Star Trek, the collective, the Borg of one mind, be of one mind to help each other. That's, not to steal each other blind. That's unfortunately what's happening now with the elites, and so forth. But anyways, let's get back to, I could go on for some time about this, but let's get back to Mr. Sowell.
When they dumped all this money into banks, the idea was the banks would then pass that money on and more lending.
Right.
Lending went down. They dumped all this money into the businesses. The businesses reduced their investment. All kinds of money is piling up. There's record amounts of money piling up.
What about GM? Surely that's the one success story. Workers are still employed. GM is now a competitive company again. They're paying back billions to the American taxpayer.
Oh, this is the famous one where we guaranteed them and it didn't cost the taxpayers a dime.
Right.
Yes. It's like going to Las Vegas, and saying, I put my quarter in the machine and out came $100. Yes. Now put another quarter and see if you get another 100. And put $1 million in there and see if you get $1 million back. We had the same thing with the savings and loan crisis a couple of decades ago. They said, we're back in the savings and loan industry, we're guaranteeing it, but it's not costing the taxpayers anything. Well, it's not until it fails, and then it costs the taxpayers.
All right. Segment 2, what is to be done now? Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke announced this past autumn that the Federal Reserve would engage in a new round of, quote, I'm using his term, quantitative easing, the so-called QE2. The Fed will purchase, wipe that smile off your face. This is serious. The Fed will purchase some $600 billion of Treasury instruments to keep interest rates low and spur economic growth. That's Ben Bernanke. On the other hand, we have our colleagues at the Hoover Institution, John Taylor, Mike Boskin, and John Kogan, signing an open letter to Ben Bernanke, which read in part, quote, we believe the large-scale asset purchase plan should be discontinued. The planned asset purchases risk currency debasement and inflation, and we do not think they will achieve the Fed's objective of promoting employment, close quote. Whose side is Tom Sowell on?
Oh, I'm on the side of people say they shouldn't have done it.
Easy, another easy one.
Oh my gosh, yes. There used to be a phrase, it was called monetizing the debt. It means that the Treasury Department has deficit spending, so they put out all these bonds that they're selling, and if the public won't buy them, the Federal Reserve will buy them because The Federal Reserve can legally print its own money. So it's no problem for the Federal Reserve to buy them. It's just that that's what that amounts to is one, inflation, and two, it amounts to a hidden tax, which will not be confined to the rich, as they call it.
Bingo. Bingity ding 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 dingo right there, right? So the Fed can buy those treasury bills, right? Or the bonds. But the thing is, if they buy them, then there's going to be inflation, right? We talked about the fact that anytime that the Fed is spending money, the government's spending money, it creates inflation, right? If we buy them, we're using earned dollars, or if rich people buy them overseas or whomever, only the Fed we only get into trouble when the Fed buys those bonds, because that means that the Fed is going to have to print more money to buy them. It's kind of a catch-22, isn't it, right? And he said something else here that I wanted to mention. Let me go back.
That's what that amounts to is one, inflation, and two, it amounts to a hidden tax.
Hidden tax. So that's what I was talking about. Yes, hidden tax. I guess it is hidden. That's a tax because of the fact that the Fed now has to pay for this stuff. It's bought some bonds. The Fed doesn't have any money. Government doesn't have. You think the government? You think your senators and your representatives and whomever, the president, whomever is going to pull some cash out of their accounts and buy this money, pay for this money? No, we have to pay for it. Hidden tax. This is the stuff you need to know. Don't vote people into office who allow these things to continue. That's all I can say. And we have to do this en masse. It can't just be one or two of us. It has to be all of us coming together to save our own collective butts. There we go.
Will not be confined to the rich, as they call it. I mean, in other words, if you've got X thousands of dollars in your bank account and the Federal Reserve starts printing more money, it is simply stealing the value of the money that you put aside. So that's the same thing as a tax. Only
stealing the money that you put aside are savings. Remember, Dr. Davies talked about that. It's when money is printed by the government, more money is printed, more money is borrowed. Your salary may go up, cost of things may go up. It's all proportional. Remember that little chart he was showing, what, like a hamburger, a car, and a house or something, and how they were all a certain amount of money. You were making 50,000, all the items were a certain amount of money each, and then you're making 100,000 after the money's been printed, and the cost of things have doubled. But the only thing that's changed is your savings. You still got $10,000, but that savings is less, right? It's a tax, hidden tax on your savings. That savings is less because of inflation.
well, it's an inflation tax.
But Tom, you're answering these questions with the greatest of ease, and you even find, I can tell from your face, you find some of the questions amusing. So a layman like me, like our viewers, says, whoa, no, wait a minute. Dr. Sowell's an eminent figure, and I even had in these emails somebody commenting on your lovely baritone voice. You're a sterling figure in all kinds of ways. But Ben Bernanke is at Princeton. In other words, what is he thinking? What does Ben Bernanke think he's doing? It can't be that easy, can it? To say, oh no, that's a mistake.
Well, Ben Bernanke is chairman of the Federal Reserve System. He's no longer a professor at Princeton. Well, he's an
emeritus, or right. He's taking a leave of absence. Right?
Yes. And so we have a whole different set of incentives and constraints on him. One of the most painful things for me was reading an article by Arthur F. Burns based on his experience when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve System.
In the 70s, this would be 60s and 70s, under Richard Nixon.
Yes.
Right.
And he spelled out that, when you're in the Federal Reserve System, you're not a free agent. It's not like you're conducting a seminar at Columbia and can just simply say and do whatever you want to do. You're operating within very narrow limits. The Federal Reserve is, quote, independent, unquote, but Congress can change the amount of that independence anytime they take a notion. And so even if you're following policies that are good policies, you've got to watch your back, because Congress can step in at any time and stop you. And so it's a very tense kind of situation.
All right.
Now, this is something that many people don't know about the Federal Reserve. It was created or put into place by the government, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. At the same time, the IRS was created. Why? Because the Federal Reserve didn't have any money. In order to collect its money, it had to tax us, right? So those two entities are working hand in hand, the Federal Reserve and the IRS. But anyway, so it has been set up as an individual or private entity, but apparently, according to Sowell, and this is something that I just learned. This is why I say you never know it all. You keep learning, and this is why I leave things up to the experts. He has a book about the what is it called? Something intellectuals. I'll have to look that up. And he talks about how intellectuals will often overstep their bounds because of the fact they go into other realms or other areas that they're not experts in, even within their own specialty. You might be maybe a scientist who's an expert in physics, but you're not an expert in biology or chemistry or something. Even there, he says, because of the fact that those systems are so complex, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be an expert. And experts, as he has said, and I have said, and as I have had my students prove time and time again, have been wrong time and time and time again. Once you've said expert, you've said wrong. Okay. Why? Because experts are no better than any other human. We are all equal in our infinite ignorance and limited resource and limited ability to move about. We can't jump into outer space and move amongst the clouds and the stars and the planets and really experience space or matter as it is, as it exists in the majority of, or a good portion of our solar system, never mind the universe. That would take too long, too much time. But anyways, so you got to be very leery of these things. You got to be a good critical thinker. You've got to really know how things work. Stop listening to non-experts. Stop listening to the media or politicians or whomever who are basically agenda driven. They will lie till the end of time to push their agenda and don't care about you or anything else other than power, influence, and money. Okay, just a little heads up, FYI.
Wall Street Journal, December 8th, quote, in accepting the deal to cut payroll and business taxes and extend all of the Bush era tax rates through 2012, as you and I speak, this hasn't been enacted in the Congress, but we're talking about the deal that President Obama cut with the Republicans. To continue the quotation, Mr. Obama has implicitly admitted that his economic strategy has flopped. He is acknowledging that tax rates matter to growth, that treating business like robber barons has hurt investment and hiring, and that tax cuts are superior to spending as stimulus, close quote. You buy every word of that?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Well, but what is painful to me, really, looking back, this argument is not a new argument. This argument was made in the 1920s. People were saying the same thing on both sides they're saying right now. The difference is that 75 years have elapsed, and there have been 4 administrations of both parties that have reduced high income tax rates every single time.
Name them.
Coolidge, Kennedy, Reagan, and George W. Bush.
Right.
Every single time, the reduction in the tax rates has led to an increase in tax revenue. So I hear people on television saying how the government can't afford to give this tax cuts to the rich. You know, they're not giving anything to anybody.
Right. Here's a question about Ricochet contributor Steve Manasek, quote, it's as close to dogma as there is among conservatives that cutting taxes, particularly marginal rates, spurs economic growth. But Bill Clinton raised taxes, including marginal rates, and the economy boomed. Do tax rates really matter to economic growth? And if they do, how do you explain the Clinton expansion?
I haven't looked at the Clinton expansion, but I know that the Clinton, quote, surplus taxes those laws are passed in Congress. All spending and taxing bills originate in the House of Representatives.
Right.
And when the House of Representatives is in the hands of the opposite party, I don't know how any president can take any credit for whether there's a surplus or not.
Okay. Milton Friedman defined a surplus as when the money comes in so fast that even Congress can't spend it.
That's true.
Segment 3, healthcare. Let me give you a quotation and a fact. The quotation comes from you in Basic Economics. Quote, A long-standing staple of political rhetoric has been the attempt to keep the prices of medical care reasonable or affordable. Yet the amount of resources required to supply the things we want are wholly independent of what we're willing to pay. It is completely unreasonable to expect reasonable prices. That's the quotation. Here's the fact. The United States devotes 17% of its GDP to healthcare. The next country down in that is Switzerland at about 11% of its GDP. So we devote something like 50% more than the next country down. Now, surely it's not unreasonable to suggest that we're just spending too much.
The question is, when people are spending their own money, I don't know how third parties can say it's too much. Well, ironically, Rahm Emanuel's brother, who's a doctor, has on board for this whole Obamacare thing. But really, he revealed why Americans spend more. Americans don't, when they go to a hospital, they are in private or semi-private rooms more often than in countries on government health care. And so instead of being in a ward, you're in your own private or semi-private room. It costs more. American doctors are more readily available. There is less waiting time. Some people prefer to pay in money and others in waiting time. Now, when you have a painful disease and the government tells you there's a 6-month waiting list, that you're paying in a different way. It doesn't show up in the statistics, but you may not even live the 6 months depending on what you have.
So we pay more and get more.
That's it.
That's it. That's all there is to it.
That's it.
You don't want to say, but at the same time, our system is terribly inefficient in various ways.
No, it's not inefficient for people to buy what they want. It was
inefficient. More complicated than that.
It's what's inefficient is having third parties decide what you need and don't need. As for example, in Sweden, where and it's not like an insurance company saying they won't pay for it. In Sweden, if they say that you don't need this, you can't pay for it with your own money because they control the whole system. And so your choice at that point is to leave Sweden, which if you're very sick may be a little hard to do, or to have what you need smuggled into you.
Right. Tom, in one of the last conversations I had with our friend Milton Friedman, I recall his saying he was musing about the future of healthcare, which, as you know, interested him for 5. In fact, there are no new ideas, just proposals by Milton Friedman that haven't gotten around to being enacted yet, I sometimes feel. But Milton said, the situation we have in this country is untenable over the longer term. And he said, broadly speaking, about 50% of American healthcare is private, subject to the usual incentives of the private market. But about 50% with Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth, about 50% is effectively socialized, run through the government in one way or another. And Milton said, this is untenable. We will probably either go to a much more socialized system in which we will at least have the virtue of controlling prices. Quality may deteriorate, but prices might be controlled. Or we'll go in the other direction and push more of healthcare into the market, which would control prices and improve quality. Does that make sense to you, that analysis?
Yeah.
It's about 50-50, but it's untenable that we're at.
I don't know why it's untenable. It's one of the few times I'm sure if he were
here, of course he'd say I misstated it
Yeah. But when people want something, and when I was in the hospital last, I had a private room. No doubt that costs more than if I were in a ward.
Right.
Particularly as in Britain, where you can be ignored by the nurses. The women in Britain, one of the scandals is that they're having their babies in the hospitals, but not in the delivery room. I mean, they're having their babies in the hallway and the elevators because they're calling for the nurse, and the nurse will get around to it when she feels like it. And the baby is not going to wait.
Okay, let me ask you then a question about practical politics. One of the points you make in basic economics is that the government, politicians face incentives the way ordinary actors in the free markets face incentives. Yes. So here's a question. It seems to me, as a layman watching things, that the people who are in favor of pushing more healthcare into the free market have been on the defensive for the last couple of years since President Obama was elected. Now we've had a change in the House of election, and Republicans have come in, and they are saying we're going to fight this thing every step of the way.
I hope they do.
Well, it still feels defensive to me. we're going to hold up the money here, we're going to file a court challenge there, and it's a kind of a piecemeal attack. How can the terms of the debate be changed, if indeed they can, so that the argument for the market becomes dominant and unself-conscious and aggressive in a certain sense?
Well, that would require articulate Republicans.
All right, now to the next question. No, well, we have. Are you encouraged when you look at the current Eric Cantor, these new people who've emerged in the House?
I must say, I saw Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey, for the first time. I thought, my gosh, an articulate Republican. When was the last time I saw one of those?
Articulate and also willing to fight.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. All right. Segment 4, trade. Lots of questions about trade, China, the rest of the world. Here's from a Ricochet member who calls her.
Now, trade is important because everybody doesn't have everything. That should be common sense economics, right? So the United States has an abundance of X, Y, and Z, and Colombia has an abundance of A, B, C, and Spain has an abundance of L, M, N, O, P, and so forth, right? So not everybody has everything that they need. Maybe we have an abundance of coal, steel, oil, right? And other countries don't. But we need certain things from those other countries that don't have an abundance in those three elements or entities, and we need to trade, right? So it's a lot easier to trade, a lot less expensive to trade, than try to enable yourself to do all that you need to do the technological and scientific upgrades and changes and modifications and whatnot to the system in order to produce something that you're lacking, right? Instead of doing all of that and making it in-house, it's a lot easier, especially if you don't need a lot of it, especially if it's not a staple. A staple is something that you need on a regular basis. Fuel is something that we need on a regular basis. That's why we've had a lot of it made in this country through various methodologies, drilling or fracking or whatever. And we at one time were actually the leaders, maybe 4 years ago or so, 5 years ago. We were the leaders of natural manufacturers, creators, miners. I don't know what the term is here. Miners or manufacturers, creators of natural gas. One of the best sources because it's clean and it runs relatively clean as well compared to fossil fuel. Anyway, so trade is essential. Trade is essential for any country who wants to keep its economy moving forward, right?
Herself, midget faded rattlesnake. If you read her post, she's highly intelligent and very amusing. I don't know where the name comes from, but here's the question. How much should people really worry about the balance of trade?
Somewhat less than you worry about being struck by lightning.
Okay, here's a statistic I heard just the other day. Here's how many cars Korea sells in the United States every year. 500,000. Here's how many cars we sell in Korea every year. 5,000. Why shouldn't we be worried about that imbalance?
I'm not sure why we should. Obviously, if the Americans were Americans forced at gunpoint to buy these cars from Korea?
Clearly not. No. So no.
I don't see why third parties should concern themselves about it.
Okay, you've done it again. You've batted away the question so easily that it leaves me wondering what the argument is on the other side. Why do some people worry about the trade balance then?
Oh, because the argument that they're making is that this is sending Americans jobs abroad. Now, unfortunately, this argument was made some years ago in 1930. 1,000 economists took out full-page ads across the country saying, do not put up international trade restrictions. It will not increase employment. It will just set off a new round of retaliation. It was one of those wonderful things of media, like it was a bipartisan effort. The Democratic Congress wanted to pass the smooth holiday tariffs, and the Republican president signed it into law. And it was one of the biggest disasters in the history of the country.
Okay, I want to skip ahead here a little bit. Let's go to economic growth. As I said, I don't want to spend all kinds of time on all of these topics. Some are more not important but relevant than others to your experience.
What about China? Do you believe that they can continue to sustain high economic growth rates without some semblance of democracy, without beginning to open up political freedoms? Can they?
I think they are doing some.
China is important. China is interesting because it's a communist. Politically, it's communist, but economically, it's free markets. And there's this philosophy that you can't have free markets without a democratic politic, but that's obviously not true. How's it faring? How's it working out? Nah, not so good, because, for instance, China is monopolizing the real estate market, and it's overextended itself. I think about 90% of all real estate is owned by the CCP, and it's having economic problems. I don't know if it's going into foreclosure, but it's not working out well. It goes to show you how important free markets are. Free markets are much easier to take care of and manage because you're allowing hundreds of thousands of millions of people to make the decisions in a very large, complicated, complex system, as opposed to an individual or handful of people trying to control hundreds of thousands, millions of people, right? That's resources and so forth. Very difficult, if not impossible. Anyways, let's take a little bit of a look at this and see what he has to say.
And particularly as you get larger and larger numbers of people who are successful in the private marketplace and who then begin to have influence, and as the old guard dies out, I think, but it'll be a very slow process. I mean, I wouldn't hold a stopwatch on it.
All right. From China to Europe. Here in the United States, nobody would start talking about the threat to the dollar as a currency if Texas experiences a high growth rate and Michigan experiences high unemployment and manufacturing decline. Nobody talks about that as a threat. But in Europe, we see that the troubles in Greece and Ireland and now Spain and Portugal are being talked about as a threat to the euro. Why?
Because they're trying to create something that a country would create in a situation where you have sovereign states. And so you can't have a common currency and then have each government go off on its own little tangent, because they'll end up in situations where that common currency is threatened because of what someone did in Greece or Spain.
Mm.
Now, an interesting point is that the US dollar, and I've talked about this before, is predominantly the standard currency, right? And that's because of the fact that the United States, one of the world's largest economies, especially proportionally, number of people to the economic strength, right? The proportion of number of people to economic strength. It's one of the strongest markets in the world, one of the most stable, dependable markets in the world. And therefore, that's why the dollar is often, there has been for quite some time. I don't know when the last time it wasn't used as a standard currency, right? So anyways, predominantly the standard currency unit in which goods are quoted, this is around the world, and traded, and with which payments are settled in the global commodity markets. Economic strength is usually very attractive. If you look at the early history of the United States, the economic strength was occurring mostly in the early years in the Chicago area, Illinois up there, Chicago, Illinois. And that's why that accent, or lack of accent, some people may say, has predominantly taken over the United States, because people like to speak, they like to be, they like to exist where the money is, right? Just like in China, a lot of young people will meet on the weekends to speak English. Why? Well, English is one of the most common languages used around the world. It's one of the most common languages used in business, in technology, in air traffic control towers, newspapers, and so forth. Why? Because behind that English is the economic growth. And I've had students, there was one from the Middle East who said, I forget where he was from, but he said that the reason why he came to the United States was to get a college degree in the United States and also to get a green card from the United States. Then he could go back to the Middle East and pretty much, you know, make deals. He could what's the phrase I'm looking for? He could make the call. You know, there's a lot of power in even being associated with that economic strength or economic consistency, right? So that's something to keep in mind of, right? And it doesn't have anything to do with prejudice or bias or whatever. It's just common sense way of being. This is the way it's been for quite some time. Like for instance, the British ruled behind the barrel of a gun for 300 years. Of course, that they overextended themselves many times in attempting to colonize and force their culture on people. That's not going to sustain itself. Forcing cultures. When you don't force cultures, when you just are an example to the world, that's when cultures are attracted to you, right? That's why more people come to this country in the millions, legally, illegally, than any other country. All right, so let's keep it going.
So do you consider the euro untenable over the longer
Just
term?
a few more minutes.
I don't know, but because people can always change their policies, and personally, I never thought it was such a great idea.
What would you have done instead? Just permit
what they've done for centuries.
All right.
Have each, have
Deutschmark, Lira.
That's it.
All right. Segment 5, theory. Lots of questioners want to know whether you share Congressman Ron Paul's skepticism of the Fed. And I'm going to quote you. This isn't in basic economics, but a recent column. Quote, for most of the history of this country, there was no Federal Reserve System. There you go, that dirty trick of bringing in history.
Oh, yeah.
There was no Federal Reserve System, which was established in 1914 to prevent bank failures. But bank failures in the 1930s exceeded anything ever seen before the Fed was established, close quote. If we could make you dictator, would you abolish the Fed?
Yes.
You would.
How about that? Get rid of the Federal Reserve, get rid of the IRS. Well, how are you going to do things? How is the government going to get its money from? And I told you about where it gets its money from. Us, basically, right? Do you need the Fed? So that's an interesting point. That, and I've heard of this before, that the fact that the majority of history of the United States, the Fed has not been here, right? I mean, how long has the United States been around? And the Fed came into being in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act, right? So what do you do? And then people will say, well, what about taxes? Get rid of the IRS. What about taxes? Well, the IRS, unfortunately, creates more problems than it solves. As the years have gone by, the amount of code or tax code has proliferated to the point now where it's getting so complex that even experts don't know anymore. They're always in argument as to what to do, right? But I guess it's also a good place to hide your dirty laundry. If you want to find loopholes, I guess you're a lawyer. I don't know. I have to talk to my lawyer friends. If you're a lawyer, it's great to have all that complexity so you can find loopholes or have loopholes, right? But anyways, let's see what he has to say about that.
Yes, I mean, for the reasons I just gave it, history. There's no, the Fed represented wonderful hopes, but we've had so many programs that represented wonderful hopes that ended in disaster. I don't doubt that someone who is sufficiently scholarly could come up with examples of where the Federal Reserve made things better. But the question is, overall, what was it supposed to do? It was supposed to do not only prevent bank failures, it was supposed to prevent huge changes in the money supply, in particular, great deflations.
Right.
The greatest deflation in American history occurred under the Federal Reserve System. There was a crisis in 1907. J.P. Morgan, the original J.P. Morgan, called the other bankers into a room, supposedly locked the doors, and said, we got to do something or we're going to all collapse. And they did something, and they didn't all collapse. But the progressives were shocked that one man could come in and take command of the situation, and especially someone who wasn't even in the government.
Right. So But so what would you do? You'd move us back to the gold standard, or you'd let
No, no.
banks issue their own currencies the way they did up through the Civil War, say? I could.
Well, they weren't doing any of those things
No.
as the time the Federal Reserve was created. We were on the gold standard, though. But whether we're on or off the gold standard, that's another whole set of arguments. There's no evidence that I can see that over this vast period of time that the Federal Reserve has existed, that things on the whole have been better. The great post-World War II inflation was fed by the Federal Reserve doing exactly what they're planning to do now, namely buying up the bonds issued by the Treasury.
Oh, but don't you have, I have to say, I wasn't expecting your answer to run in this direction. So I don't have questions, follow-up questions prepared, or I may actually have to think here in real time. But don't we have the example of that period from 83 through a couple of years ago, that 25 years of economic expansion? We had only two downturns. They were both very shallow and very brief. And what you had was Paul Volcker, whom Carter appointed, but Reagan gave the freedom actually to wring inflation out of the currency. He did that by the mid-'80s. The economy takes off. Alan Greenspan does a reasonably good job. And then at the end, there's too much money in the, but maybe 5 years of getting it wrong. So
what Volcker did was undo the harm that previous Federal Reserves had done,
including Arthur Burns.
Yeah, unfortunately, who was my teacher and one of my much admired.
Right, right. So, but what would you replace it with? How would the currency? How would the currency run?
We would replace it. We could replace it with what existed when it was created,
which was the gold standard.
Well, it may be the gold standard, but maybe not. But there's no evidence that what would you replace it? Things always bother me. You know, when someone removes the cancer, what do you replace it with?
Okay. All right. Closing few questions here that didn't really seem to fit into, but they struck.
All right, I'm gonna end it there. If you want to get into those closing questions, you may. So that's kind of a good look at Thomas Sowell. If you want to learn more about economic issues, social issues, political issues, very, very, very interesting, insightful guy to listen to. And he's probably in his 90s now. He's been around for decades, since the 50s, the 60s, I guess. Yeah. So he's been at this for quite some time. It's very interesting, very informative. All right. So Milton Friedman, they mentioned old Milton Friedman there. So he's the last one we're going to take a look at in our basic economics series. All right. So that's it. Until then, we'll see you. Have a good day. Take care.